When 19-year-old Chloe Wilson pulled her beat-up Ford pickup behind the smoking Peterbilt on Interstate 80, the seasoned truckers watching from the truck stop across the highway shook their heads in disbelief. What could a college kid possibly know about fixing a blown diesel engine that had stumped 3 professional mechanics? But when Chloe crawled under the massive rig with nothing but a pocket flashlight and emerged 20 minutes later, announcing that the turbocharger's wastegate actuator had failed due to carbon buildup in the exhaust gas recirculation system, State Trooper Nathan Cooper knew he was witnessing something extraordinary. The real shock came when Cooper finally noticed the worn military dog tags hanging around her neck, tags that bore a name he recognized from the most terrifying night of his deployment in Afghanistan, when Sergeant Major Diana Foster had saved his unit from an IED ambush before making the ultimate sacrifice. Quick pause before we continue. Tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing. The November wind cut across the Nebraska plains like a razor, carrying the scent of diesel exhaust and the promise of an early winter storm. Mile marker 247 on Interstate 80 had become an impromptu gathering place for anyone with mechanical knowledge and good intentions. But after 4 hours of failed attempts to diagnose the massive Peterbilt's engine failure, even the most experienced truckers were running out of ideas. Chloe Wilson had been driving home from her afternoon classes at Prairie View Community College when she spotted the disabled semi through the swirling dust kicked up by passing traffic. The truck sat at an odd angle on the shoulder, its hood raised like a metallic mouth crying for help, while its owner paced nearby with the frustrated energy of a man watching his livelihood evaporate with each passing hour. She recognized the desperation immediately. Growing up in a trucking family meant understanding that a broken-down rig wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a financial catastrophe that could ripple through a family's entire existence. Her father, Raymond, had drilled that lesson into her from an early age, along with the mechanical knowledge that now seemed as natural as breathing. The Peterbilt's owner was a weathered man in his 50s, with calloused hands and worry lines etched deep around his eyes. His name was Bill Hendricks, and he'd been driving trucks for 32 years without ever facing a problem this baffling. The engine had been running smoothly when he'd stopped for fuel in Grand Island, but 20 miles down the road, it had suddenly lost power, belching black smoke before finally giving up completely. "Compression's good, fuel's flowing, electrical system checks out," Bill explained to the small crowd of would-be mechanics who had gathered around his truck. "Hell, I've rebuilt engines that were in worse shape than this one looks, but I can't figure out what's got her so mad." Dutch Anderson, the grizzled owner of Sunrise Truck Stop, had driven over in his wrecker after hearing the CB chatter about the breakdown. At 67, Dutch had seen every possible mechanical failure that could afflict a diesel engine, but this particular Peterbilt had him stumped too. He'd spent an hour checking fuel injectors, testing sensors, and running through diagnostic procedures that should have revealed the problem. "Might be time to call for a tow," Dutch suggested reluctantly, knowing the words would hit Bill like a physical blow. "Get her into my shop where I can really tear into the engine, but I gotta be honest with you, Bill. This could be expensive." "Bill," Hendricks kicked at a piece of gravel, his jaw working as he calculated the cost of a major engine repair against his current bank balance. The mathematics of trucking were unforgiving, and unexpected breakdowns had a way of transforming financial struggles into outright disasters. That's when Chloe Wilson's Ford pickup appeared in the distance, its faded blue paint and rust spots marking it as a working vehicle rather than a showpiece. She pulled onto the shoulder 50 yards behind the disabled Peterbilt, her hazard lights blinking as she surveyed the scene with the analytical eye of someone who had grown up solving mechanical puzzles. State Trooper Nathan Cooper had been monitoring. the situation from his patrol car parked on the overpass above, making sure the breakdown didn't create a traffic hazard while staying close enough to assist if needed. Cooper was methodical by nature, a trait that had served him well during his military service and continued to guide his approach to highway patrol work. He'd already called for additional traffic control if the situation dragged on much longer. But he found himself curious about the young woman who had just arrived at what was clearly a mechanical crisis beyond most people's abilities. Chloe stepped out of her truck and immediately assessed the situation with a confidence that seemed to surprise the men gathered around the Peterbilt. She wore faded jeans, work boots that had seen plenty of use, and a Prairie View Community College sweatshirt that marked her as a student. But there was something in her posture, in the way she moved toward the disabled truck, that suggested she belonged in this environment despite her age and gender. "What have you tried so far?" she asked Bill Hendricks, her voice carrying the slight drawl common to the region, but with an underlying precision that suggested technical training. Bill looked skeptical. "No offense, miss, but we've had some pretty experienced mechanics looking at this problem. It's not something that's likely to be fixed by a girl," Chloe interrupted with a slight smile that carried no offense, just mild amusement. "My daddy's been driving trucks since before I was born, and I've been crawling around diesel engines since I could walk. Sometimes fresh eyes see things that experience might miss." Dutch Anderson studied her with the appraising look of someone who had learned not to judge mechanical ability by appearances. "You Raymond Wilson's daughter?" he asked, recognition dawning in his weathered features. "That's right," Chloe confirmed. "Chloe Wilson. And you're Dutch Anderson. Dad's mentioned your shop plenty of times. Says you're the best diesel mechanic between here and Denver." The compliment earned her Dutch's attention, and he found himself nodding toward the engine compartment. "Well, if you're Raymond's girl, I suppose you might know which end of a wrench to hold, but I've been looking at this engine for over an hour, and it's got me scratched." Chloe approached the Peterbilt with the systematic methodology her father had taught her, but her movements also carried something else, an intuitive understanding of mechanical systems that went beyond textbook knowledge. She listened to the engines idle, with her head tilted slightly, as if the diesel's irregular rhythm was speaking a language only she could understand. "When did you first notice the power loss?" she asked Bill while examining the turbocharger. "Housing about 20 miles back," he replied, his skepticism beginning to give way to curiosity. "Was running fine, then suddenly felt like someone cut the power in half. Black smoke started pouring out, and she just wouldn't respond to the throttle." Chloe nodded, her fingers tracing the exhaust manifold connections while her mind processed the symptoms. The way she moved around the engine suggested familiarity with these systems that extended far beyond casual observation. When she knelt to examine the turbocharger more closely, the military dog tags around her neck caught the afternoon light, their worn surfaces reflecting a history that none of the men present could have imagined. From his position on the overpass, Nathan Cooper found himself paying closer attention to the scene unfolding below. Something about the young woman's approach to the mechanical problem reminded him of the military engineers he'd worked with overseas. Methodical, confident, and unafraid to tackle complex technical challenges. But it was more than that. There was something familiar about her bearing, something that triggered memories he wasn't quite ready to examine. "Mind if I crawl under there and take a look?" Chloe asked, already reaching for the pocket flashlight she always carried. Bill Hendricks hesitated for a moment, then shrugged. "Can't hurt, I suppose, but be careful. That engine's been running hot." Chloe disappeared under the massive truck with the fluid grace of someone who had spent countless hours in similar positions. The men above could hear her moving around beneath the engine, occasionally muttering technical observations that suggested she was conducting a thorough diagnostic examination. Dutch Anderson found himself impressed despite his initial reservations. "Girl moves like she knows what she's doing," he admitted to Bill. "Raymond always said she had a gift for understanding machines," Bill replied, remembering conversations with Chloe's father from truck stops across the Midwest. Said she could diagnose problems just by listening to an engine run. 20 minutes later, Chloe emerged from beneath the truck with grease smudges on her sweatshirt and a look of satisfaction on her face. She wiped her hands on a rag Dutch offered before delivering her diagnosis with the confidence of someone who had found exactly what she was looking for. "Your turbocharger's wastegate actuator has failed," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of certain knowledge. "There's significant carbon buildup in the exhaust gas recirculation system that's been causing the wastegate to stick intermittently. When it finally seized completely, your boost pressure dropped to almost nothing, which explains the power loss and black smoke." The silence that followed her explanation was profound. Dutch Anderson stared at her with undisguised amazement, while Bill Hendricks struggled to process what he'd just heard. The technical precision of her diagnosis was impressive enough, but the certainty with which she delivered it suggested a depth of mechanical understanding that seemed impossible for someone her age. "You sure about that?" Dutch asked, though his tone suggested he was already convinced. "Positive," Chloe replied. "The carbon buildup has been developing gradually over thousands of miles, but today's operating conditions, probably the combination of temperature and load factors, caused the final seizure. It's actually a relatively straightforward fix if you have the right parts and tools." Nathan Cooper climbed down from his patrol car and approached the group, his curiosity finally overcoming his professional detachment. He arrived just as Dutch was confirming Chloe's diagnosis with a more detailed examination of the turbocharger assembly. "Well, I'll be damned," Dutch muttered from under the hood. "Girl's absolutely right. Wastegate's seized solid, and there's carbon buildup everywhere. In 30 years of working on diesels, I've never seen anyone diagnose this problem that quickly." Cooper studied Chloe Wilson with the analytical attention he'd learned to apply to situations that didn't fit normal patterns. There was something about her competence, her bearing, the way she'd approached a complex mechanical problem that reminded him of military personnel he'd worked with overseas. Professional, methodical, unflappable under pressure. But it was when she turned to answer Bill Hendricks's questions about repair procedures that Cooper finally noticed the dog tags hanging around her neck. The worn metal identification discs were partially hidden beneath her sweatshirt, but enough was visible to trigger a flood of memories that Cooper had spent years trying to suppress. The name on those tags, barely visible in the afternoon light, was one that Cooper would never forget. Sergeant Major Diana Foster, the combat engineer who had saved his unit from an IED ambush in Afghanistan and who had paid for that heroism with her life. Cooper felt the world shift around him as 8 years of carefully buried trauma crashed back into his consciousness. The young woman who had just solved an impossible mechanical problem was wearing the dog tags of the soldier who had saved his life. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Nathan Cooper stood frozen beside the disabled Peterbilt, his mind reeling as memories of Afghanistan crashed through the careful barriers he'd constructed over 8 years of trying to forget. The dog tags around Chloe Wilson's neck bore the name of a woman who had saved his life at the cost of her own, and seeing them here on a Nebraska highway felt like encountering a ghost from his most traumatic deployment. Diana Foster had been more than just another soldier in Cooper's unit. She'd been the kind of combat engineer who could jury-rig solutions to impossible problems under enemy fire, and her technical brilliance had been matched only by her fierce protectiveness of the soldiers under her command. The night she died, she'd identified an IED ambush that would have killed Cooper's entire squad, then deliberately triggered the trap herself to create an escape route for her fellow soldiers. Cooper forced himself to focus on the present as Chloe continued explaining the repair procedure to Bill Hendricks and Dutch Anderson. Her voice carried the same calm confidence that Diana had possessed, the same methodical approach to complex technical problems. The resemblance was unsettling in ways that Cooper wasn't prepared to examine. The wastegate actuator itself can be replaced, Chloe was saying, but you'll also need to clean out the entire EGR system to prevent the problem from recurring. It's about a 6-hour job with the right equipment, maybe 8 if you run into complications with the carbon deposits. Dutch Anderson nodded approvingly. That's exactly right. I've got the parts at my shop and the cleaning equipment to do the job properly. But I have to ask, where'd you learn to diagnose turbocharger problems like that? Most mechanics with decades of experience would have missed what you spotted in 20 minutes. Chloe's hand moved unconsciously to her throat, her fingers touching the dog tags in a gesture that Cooper recognized as both protective and reverent. My Aunt Diana taught me that complex problems usually have simple solutions if you understand the underlying systems, she said quietly. She always said that mechanical failures follow logical patterns. You just have to know how to listen to what the machinery is trying to tell you. The mention of Diana's name hit Cooper like a physical blow. He found himself struggling to breathe as the connection became undeniably clear. This young woman wasn't just wearing Diana Foster's dog tags as some kind of tribute. She was family, carrying forward the legacy of a soldier whose sacrifice had haunted Cooper's dreams for nearly a decade. Bill Hendricks pulled out his wallet and started counting the crumpled bills inside, his weathered face showing the strain of calculating repair costs against his limited resources. "How much is this gonna run me, Dutch? I've got about $800 in cash, and my credit's maxed. Out from the last breakdown in Colorado." Dutch's expression softened with the understanding that came from decades of working with independent truckers who lived on razor-thin profit margins. "Tell you what, Bill, you pay for the parts and I'll cut the labor charge in half. Can't afford to work for free, but I remember what it was like when I was starting out." "I appreciate that, Dutch, but even half your labor rate puts this repair out of my reach," Bill admitted with the quiet dignity of a man facing financial disaster. "Maybe I should just call the bank and see if they'll extend my equipment loan." Chloe had been listening to this exchange with growing concern, recognizing the familiar desperation that came when mechanical failures threatened to destroy someone's livelihood. She'd seen her father face similar crises, and she understood how quickly a single breakdown could cascade into bankruptcy for an independent trucker. "What if there was another option?" she asked, her voice carrying a tentative quality that suggested she was working through an idea as she spoke. "I mean, what if someone could walk you through the repair procedure step by step, so you could do most of the work yourself?" Dutch looked skeptical. "This isn't shade tree mechanic work, miss. You're talking about precision tolerances and specialized tools. One mistake could turn an $800 repair into a $15,000 engine replacement." "I understand the risks," Chloe replied, her confidence growing as she developed her proposal. "But Mr. Hendricks obviously knows his way around an engine, and with the right guidance and careful supervision, there's no reason he couldn't handle most of the procedure himself. It would save him thousands in labor costs." Cooper found himself studying Chloe's face as she outlined her plan, seeing in her expressions the same combination of technical competence and human compassion that had defined Diana Foster's approach to every challenge. The resemblance was more than physical. It was a fundamental similarity in character that suggested Diana's influence had extended far beyond mechanical training. "You'd be willing to supervise that kind of repair?" Dutch asked, his tone shifting from skepticism to genuine interest. Because if you're talking about what I think you're talking about, we'd need someone who really understands turbocharger systems to make sure nothing goes wrong. Chloe nodded firmly. I've assisted with this exact repair procedure twice before, and I've rebuilt wastegate actuators on smaller engines as part of my coursework at Prairie View. As long as we take our time and follow proper safety procedures, there's no reason it couldn't work. Bill Hendricks looked up from his wallet with an expression that mixed hope with desperate calculation. How much would something like that cost? I mean, if you were willing to help supervise the work? Nothing, Chloe replied immediately. My aunt always taught me that when someone needs help and you have the knowledge to provide it, you help. That's what service means, looking out for each other. The mention of service in connection with Diana Foster's teachings hit Cooper with another wave of recognition. Diana had used almost those exact words during their last conversation in Afghanistan, explaining why she'd volunteered for the dangerous reconnaissance mission that would ultimately cost her life. The echo was so precise that Cooper began to wonder if Diana had somehow communicated her philosophy to her niece before her deployment. Dutch Anderson was nodding slowly, his professional instincts warring with his obvious respect for Chloe's technical knowledge. I'd have to insist on doing the final inspection myself, he said carefully, and Bill would need to sign a waiver acknowledging the risks. But if you're confident about supervising the work, and if Bill's willing to take responsibility for any complications, I'll sign whatever you need, Bill interrupted, his relief palpable. Miss Wilson, if you're serious about this, you'd be saving my business. Hell, you'd probably be saving my family. Cooper watched this exchange with growing amazement, recognizing the same selfless commitment to helping others that had characterized Diana Foster's entire military career. But there was something else happening here, something that went beyond simple mechanical assistance. Chloe Wilson was demonstrating the kind of leadership and technical competence that suggested she'd inherited more than just Diana's dog tags. When could we start the repair? Chloe asked Dutch, already shifting into planning mode with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing complex projects. Shop's clear tomorrow morning, Dutch replied, but this is going to be an all-day job, maybe longer if we run into complications. You sure you can commit that kind of time? Chloe checked her phone for her class schedule, then nodded. I've got one morning class I'll need to skip, but Dr. Grant will understand when I explain the situation. She's always encouraging students to apply our engineering knowledge to real-world problems. Cooper found himself stepping forward, drawn into the conversation by a combination of professional curiosity and personal connection to the situation that he wasn't quite ready to acknowledge. Excuse me, he said, his voice carrying the formal tone he'd learned to use when uncertain about appropriate boundaries. I couldn't help overhearing your repair plans. Are you folks confident about the safety aspects of this kind of work? Chloe turned to face the state trooper, and Cooper felt another jolt of recognition as he saw Diana Foster's intelligent brown eyes looking back at him from a face that bore subtle but unmistakable family resemblances. Safety's always the first priority, she replied with the automatic response of someone who'd been trained in proper procedures from an early age. We'll follow all standard protocols for working around heavy machinery, and Mr. Anderson will be supervising every step of the process. I'm Nathan Cooper, State Patrol, he introduced himself, extending his hand with the formal courtesy that covered his emotional turbulence. I just want to make sure everyone understands the liability issues involved in this kind of roadside assistance. Chloe shook his hand with a firm grip that reminded Cooper painfully of Diana's confident handshake. During their first meeting in Afghanistan, Chloe Wilson, she replied, and I appreciate your concern, Trooper Cooper. We'll make sure everything's done properly and safely. The sound of her name spoken aloud hit Cooper with unexpected force. Diana had talked about her family during their long conversations in Afghanistan, and Cooper distinctly remembered her mentioning a niece named Chloe who was interested in engineering. Diana had been proud of the young girl's mechanical aptitude, often sharing stories about Chloe's precocious ability to understand complex systems. Foster, Cooper said suddenly, the word escaping before he could stop himself. Those dog tags, they belonged to Diana Foster. Chloe's entire demeanor changed in an instant, her casual confidence replaced by a wariness that suggested she'd learned to be protective of her aunt's memory. "Did you know her?" she asked carefully, her hand moving to cover the dog tags in a gesture that was both defensive and reverent. Cooper felt 8 years of suppressed grief and survivor's guilt rushing to the surface as he struggled to find words adequate for what he needed to say. "She saved my life," he managed finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Afghanistan, 2016. Sergeant Major Foster identified an IED ambush that would have killed my entire squad. She deliberately triggered the trap to create an escape route for the rest of us." The silence that followed Cooper's revelation was profound. Dutch Anderson and Bill Hendricks exchanged glances that acknowledged they were witnessing something far more significant than a chance encounter, while Chloe stared at Cooper with an expression that cycled through surprise, recognition, and something deeper that might have been destiny. "You were with the 82nd Engineering Battalion," Chloe said quietly, not asking but confirming something she already knew. Aunt Diana talked about that deployment in her letters home. She mentioned a young corporal who was working on communication systems, someone who reminded her why the mission mattered. Cooper nodded, struggling with the impossibility of what was happening. "She talked about you too," he admitted. "Said you were going to be an engineer someday, that you had a gift for understanding how things worked. She was proud of you." Chloe's eyes filled with tears that she quickly blinked away, her emotional control reflecting the same military bearing that had characterized her aunt's approach to difficult situations. "She died before I could tell her I'd been accepted to engineering school," she said softly. "These dog tags are all I have left of her, besides the things she taught me about fixing what's broken." Cooper felt a profound sense of completion washing over him as he understood the significance of this moment. For 8 years, he'd carried the guilt of surviving when Diana Foster hadn't, questioning whether his life had been worth her sacrifice. Now standing on a Nebraska highway, watching Diana's niece use the knowledge and values her aunt had instilled to help a stranger in need, Cooper began to understand that Diana's legacy lived on in ways that transcended individual survival. "She'd be proud of what you did here today," Cooper said, his voice gaining strength as he found the words he'd been searching for since Diana's death. "Using your knowledge to help someone in trouble? That's exactly what she would have done." Chloe smiled through her tears, and for a moment Cooper could see Diana Foster's spirit shining through her niece's eyes. "Then I guess we'd better get Mr. Hendrick's truck fixed properly," she said with renewed determination. "Aunt Diana always said the best way to honor someone's memory is to carry forward their values." As the group began making concrete plans for the next day's repair work, Cooper realized that his encounter with Chloe Wilson had changed something fundamental about how he understood his own survival and Diana Foster's sacrifice. The guilt that had haunted him for 8 years was beginning to transform into something else. A recognition that Diana's death had meaning precisely because people like Chloe existed to carry forward her legacy of service and technical excellence. The November wind continued to cut across the Nebraska plains, but somehow the approaching storm seemed less threatening now, as if the connections being forged on this stretch of highway possessed the power to weather whatever difficulties lay ahead. The morning sun cast long shadows across Dutch Anderson's truck repair facility as Chloe Wilson arrived at sunrise, carrying a worn leather toolbox that had belonged to her father, and a thermos of coffee strong enough to wake the dead. The Peterbilt sat in the main service bay like a patient awaiting surgery, its hood already raised to reveal the complex maze of diesel engine components that would challenge even experienced mechanics. Dutch was already at work, laying out specialized tools with the methodical precision of someone who understood that proper preparation prevented costly mistakes. At 57, he moved with the careful efficiency of a man whose body bore the accumulated wear of decades spent wrestling with stubborn machinery, but his weathered hands remained steady and sure. "Morning, Miss Wilson," Dutch called out as Chloe approached the service bay. "Sleep well, because we're going to need all our concentration for what we're attempting today." Chloe set down her toolbox and surveyed the engine compartment with the analytical eye her Aunt Diana had taught her to apply to complex mechanical problems. "I've been thinking about the procedure all night," she admitted, pulling a small notebook from her back pocket. "I sketched out a step-by-step process that should minimize the risk of complications." The notebook was filled with detailed diagrams showing turbocharger configurations, torque specifications, and safety checkpoints that would guide them through the repair. Dutch studied her drawings with growing respect, recognizing the thoroughness that separated professional quality work from amateur attempts. "You've really thought this through," he observed, his initial skepticism giving way to genuine appreciation. "These tolerance measurements are exactly right, and your safety protocols are better than what most trade schools teach." Bill Hendricks arrived 20 minutes later, his face showing the strain of a man who'd spent the night calculating and recalculating the financial implications of various outcomes. He'd brought his own set of basic tools and a determination born of desperation, but also a willingness to follow instructions that suggested he understood the gravity of what they were attempting. "Morning, folks," Bill said, his voice carrying forced optimism over underlying anxiety. "I've been reading up on turbocharger repairs all night. Figure if I'm going to be working on my own engine, I should understand what I'm doing." Nathan Cooper appeared in the doorway of the service bay, having stopped by on his way to begin his patrol shift. He'd told himself he was just checking on the safety aspects of the repair work, but the truth was more complicated. His encounter with Chloe Wilson had triggered memories and emotions he'd spent years trying to suppress, and he found himself drawn to witness how Diana Foster's legacy would manifest in her niece's work. "How's everything looking this morning?" Cooper asked, his official tone masking personal curiosity about how Chloe would handle the pressure of supervising such a complex repair. Chloe looked up from her notebook, and Cooper was struck again by the resemblance to Diana Foster, not just physical, but in the way she carried herself when facing a technical challenge. "We're ready to begin," she replied with quiet confidence. "The key is going to be taking our time and following proper procedures at every step." Dr. Rebecca Grant arrived unexpectedly, having heard about her students' ambitious project through the small-town network that connected Prairie View Community College to the local business community. At 43, Dr. Grant had spent 15 years trying to interest students in practical applications of engineering principles, and Chloe's real-world problem-solving approach represented exactly the kind of learning she hoped to encourage. "I hope you don't mind my observing," Dr. Grant said to Dutch, her academic curiosity evident despite her attempt at casual interest. "It's not often I get to see my students apply classroom theory to this level of practical challenge." Dutch nodded his approval, understanding that additional oversight might actually improve their safety margin. "More eyes on the process means less chance of missing something important," he agreed. "But everyone needs to understand that this is still dangerous work around heavy machinery. Chloe began the repair procedure by walking Bill through a comprehensive safety briefing that covered everything from proper lifting techniques to the specific hazards associated with pressurized diesel systems. Her approach was thorough, without being condescending, recognizing Bill's experience while ensuring he understood the unique risks of turbocharger work. The most important thing to remember, Chloe explained as they prepared to disconnect the turbocharger assembly, is that we're dealing with components that operate under extreme pressure and temperature conditions. Any shortcuts in procedure could result in catastrophic failure that would destroy the entire engine. The actual repair work began with the painstaking process of removing contaminated components from the exhaust gas recirculation system. Chloe guided Bill through each step, her instructions delivered with the clear precision of someone who understood that mechanical work required both technical knowledge and careful communication. Cooper found himself fascinated by Chloe's teaching style, which reminded him powerfully of Diana Foster's approach to training young soldiers. Diana had possessed the same ability to break down complex procedures into manageable steps while maintaining awareness of overall system relationships. Watching Chloe work, Cooper began to understand how Diana's influence had shaped her niece's approach to technical challenges. Notice how the carbon buildup is heaviest right here at the valve junction, Chloe pointed out as they exposed the damaged components. That's because this is where exhaust gases spend the most time at high temperature, which accelerates the carbon formation process. Bill Hendricks proved to be an attentive student, following Chloe's instructions with the careful attention of someone who understood that his financial future depended on getting every detail right. His questions were intelligent and focused, suggesting that his decades of trucking experience had given him a solid foundation for understanding diesel engine principles. Dutch Anderson supervised the work with the watchful eye of a master craftsman who understood that teaching moments could easily become expensive mistakes if proper oversight wasn't maintained. But as the morning progressed, he found himself increasingly impressed by Chloe's combination of technical knowledge and practical safety awareness. "Girl knows what she's doing," Dutch murmured to Dr. Grant during a brief break in the work. "I've seen professional mechanics with decades of experience who don't approach complex repairs with this level of systematic thinking." Dr. Grant nodded, making notes about Chloe's problem-solving methodology that she intended to incorporate into her classroom teaching. She's always been exceptional in theoretical coursework, but seeing her apply that knowledge to real-world challenges is remarkable. The military background in her family obviously provided excellent foundational training. The mention of military training reminded Cooper of conversations he'd had with Diana Foster about the intersection between combat engineering and civilian mechanical work. Diana had often talked about how military technical training emphasized systematic approaches and safety protocols that served soldiers well in both military and civilian careers. As they reached the most delicate phase of the repair, removing the seized wastegate actuator without damaging surrounding components, Chloe's concentration became almost meditative. Her movements were precise and deliberate, each action carefully considered before execution. Cooper recognized the same methodical approach that Diana had used when dealing with improvised explosive devices in Afghanistan. "Easy does it, Chloe," coached as Bill worked to free the final connection. "Remember, we're not trying to force anything. If there's resistance, we stop and figure out why before proceeding." The wastegate actuator came free with a satisfying click, revealing the extent of carbon contamination that had caused the original failure. The component was completely seized, its moving parts locked solid by the accumulated deposits that had built up over thousands of miles of operation. "Well, there's your culprit," Dutch observed, examining the failed component. Things built up so much carbon it couldn't move if its life depended on it, which, in a way, it did. Bill Hendricks held the damaged part with something approaching reverence, understanding that this small component had nearly destroyed his livelihood. "How long does something like this take to develop?" he asked. "Months, maybe years," Chloe explained. "It's a gradual process that accelerates under certain operating conditions. High sulfur fuel, extended idle times, incomplete combustion cycles, they all contribute to carbon buildup. The key is regular maintenance and understanding the warning signs before complete failure occurs." Cooper found himself thinking about the parallels between mechanical failures and the kind of systematic problems he'd encountered in military logistics. Both required understanding complex relationships between multiple variables, and both benefited from the kind of methodical analysis that Chloe was demonstrating. As the afternoon wore on, the repair work progressed steadily through the cleaning and replacement phases. Chloe's supervision remained constant but unobtrusive, offering guidance when needed while allowing Bill to develop confidence in his own abilities. Her teaching approach emphasized understanding rather than mere instruction, ensuring that Bill would be better equipped to prevent similar problems in the future. "The new actuator has to be calibrated precisely," Chloe explained, as they prepared to install the replacement component. "Too loose and you'll get inadequate boost pressure. Too tight and you risk premature failure. It's all about finding the exact specification for this particular engine configuration." Dr. Grant observed this calibration process with academic interest, recognizing how Chloe's practical experience complemented and enhanced her formal engineering education. The integration of theoretical knowledge with hands-on problem-solving represented exactly the kind of learning outcomes that engineering programs struggled to achieve. Dutch Anderson performed the final inspection with characteristic thoroughness, checking every connection and testing all system pressures before declaring the repair complete. His approval carried the weight of professional authority, and his satisfaction with the work reflected well on Chloe's supervision and Bill's execution. "Outstanding job, both of you," Dutch announced, as the engine fired up with the smooth rumble of properly functioning diesel power. "This repair is as good as anything I could have done myself, and Bill saved himself about $2,000 in labor costs." Bill Hendricks' relief was palpable as he listened to his engine running normally for the first time in 2 days. The financial disaster that had threatened to destroy his business had been transformed into a manageable expense, and he'd gained valuable knowledge about maintaining his equipment in the process. "Miss Wilson, I can't thank you enough," Bill said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved my business and you taught me things about my own truck that I never understood before." Cooper watched this exchange with a profound sense of completion, understanding that Diana Foster's sacrifice had indeed created ripple effects that extended far beyond the military unit she'd saved in Afghanistan. Through her niece's actions, Diana's commitment to helping others continued to make a difference in ways that she never could have imagined. As the day wound down and the various participants prepared to return to their normal routines, Cooper realized that his encounter with Chloe Wilson had fundamentally changed his understanding of survival, sacrifice, and service. The guilt that had haunted him for 8 years was beginning to transform into something else, a recognition that Diana's legacy lived on through people like Chloe, who carried forward her values of technical excellence and selfless service. To others, the successful repair of Bill Hendricks's truck represented more than just mechanical problem-solving. It demonstrated how knowledge passed down through generations could continue to serve community needs, how individual acts of service could prevent larger disasters, and how the values that defined military service could find meaningful expression in civilian life. Standing in Dutch Anderson's service bay as the November afternoon light slanted through the windows, Cooper felt something he hadn't experienced since Afghanistan, a sense that Diana Foster's sacrifice had meaning that transcended individual survival, creating possibilities for service and connection that honored her memory while building toward a future she would have been proud to see. 3 weeks after the successful repair of Bill Hendrick's Peterbilt, word of Chloe Wilson's mechanical expertise had spread through the tight-knit trucking community like wildfire across prairie grass. Dutch Anderson's phone rang constantly with requests from drivers who had heard about the young woman who could diagnose complex engine problems that stumped experienced mechanics, and Chloe found herself fielding calls at all hours from truckers. Facing breakdowns across the region, the attention was flattering but overwhelming for someone trying to balance community college coursework with increasing demands for her technical assistance. Chloe had always been driven by her Aunt Diana's philosophy of helping others, but she was beginning to understand that good intentions needed to be balanced with practical limitations if she hoped to complete her engineering education. Nathan. Cooper had made it a point to check in on Chloe's activities, telling himself it was simple professional interest in someone who had become a local figure of sorts. The truth was more complex. His encounter with Diana Foster's niece had awakened memories and emotions he'd spent years suppressing, and he found himself curious about how she would handle the growing pressures of her unexpected reputation. The morning that would change. Everything began like dozens of others, with Chloe reviewing thermodynamics equations in her pickup truck while waiting for her advanced mathematics class to begin at Prairie View Community College. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Alan Richards, the chief dispatcher at Midwest Freight Lines, asking if she could take a look at a truck that was experiencing intermittent power losses on Interstate 80. Chloe hesitated before responding, aware that her informal consulting work was beginning to interfere with her academic responsibilities. Dr. Rebecca Grant had been understanding about occasional absences, but Chloe knew she couldn't maintain her current course load while continuing to provide unlimited assistance to every trucker who requested her help. Her phone rang before she could finish composing a response to Alan's text. The caller was Alan himself, and his voice carried an urgency that suggested this wasn't a routine request for mechanical advice. "Chloe, thank God you answered," Alan said without preamble. "I've got a driver stranded at mile marker 315, and this isn't just about a broken truck. There's something suspicious about the whole situation, and I think someone's trying to set him up." The allegation caught Chloe off guard. In her experience, trucking problems were mechanical rather than criminal, involving failed components and maintenance issues rather than deliberate sabotage. "What kind of setup?" she asked carefully. "Driver's name is Carlos Mendoza, been with our company for 12 years without a single safety violation," Alan explained. "Yesterday, his truck started losing power intermittently, and this morning, it failed completely just before reaching the way station. Now there's a state inspector claiming the engine's been modified illegally to defeat emissions controls." Chloe felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November weather. Emissions violations carried severe penalties for commercial drivers, including substantial fines and potential license suspension. For an independent contractor like Carlos Mendoza, such charges could mean financial ruin and the end of his career. "Are you sure the modifications weren't legitimate?" Chloe asked, though Alan's tone suggested he'd already considered that possibility. "Carlos is as honest as they come, and he's never had emissions problems before," Alan replied firmly. "Plus, The inspector is demanding immediate impoundment of the truck pending investigation, which isn't standard procedure for routine violations. Something about this whole situation feels wrong. Chloe checked her class schedule, weighing her academic obligations against what sounded like a trucker in serious trouble. Dr. Grant would understand if she explained the circumstances, and the thermodynamics equations would still be there when she returned. "I'll head out there now," Chloe decided. "Text me the exact location and any other details you think might be relevant." 20 minutes later, Chloe's Ford pickup pulled onto the shoulder near mile marker 315, where a scene of bureaucratic confrontation was unfolding around Carlos Mendoza's disabled semi-truck. A state emissions inspector was conducting what appeared to be an unusually thorough examination of the engine compartment, while Carlos stood nearby with the frustrated helplessness of someone watching his livelihood being dissected by official authority. Nathan Cooper was also present, having responded to a request for law enforcement assistance with what the inspector had described as a serious emissions violation case. Cooper recognized Chloe's truck immediately and found himself curious about what had drawn her to this particular situation. "Miss Wilson," Cooper said as Chloe approached the group, "what brings you out here this morning?" "Alan Richards called about Mr. Mendoza's truck problems," Chloe replied, studying the scene with the analytical attention she'd learned to apply to complex situations. He thought there might be something unusual about the emissions inspection. The state inspector was a thin man in his 40s named Kevin Walsh, whose officious manner and aggressive approach to the examination seemed disproportionate to the nature of routine emissions compliance work. He looked up from the engine compartment with obvious irritation when he noticed Chloe's arrival. "This is an official state inspection," Walsh announced with exaggerated authority. "Unauthorized personnel need to maintain a safe distance from the vehicle." Cooper studied Walsh's behavior with the suspicious eye of someone trained to recognize when official procedures weren't being followed properly. The inspector's aggressive tone and apparent rush to impound the truck suggested motivations that extended beyond simple regulatory enforcement. "What specific violations are you investigating?" Cooper asked, his question carrying the weight of legitimate law enforcement interest. Walsh hesitated for a moment before responding, suggesting he hadn't expected to be questioned about his procedures. "Illegal modification of emissions control equipment," he replied finally. "This vehicle appears to have been deliberately altered to defeat federal environmental regulations." Chloe stepped closer to examine the engine compartment, her technical knowledge allowing her to quickly assess the modifications Walsh was claiming to have discovered. What she saw didn't match his allegations, and the discrepancies were significant, enough to raise serious questions about his conclusions. "Excuse me," Chloe said politely, "but could you point out the specific modifications you're referring to? Because from what I can see, all the emissions control components appear to be factory standard installations." Walsh's face flushed with irritation at being challenged by someone he obviously considered unqualified to question his professional judgment. "Young lady, I've been conducting emissions inspections for 15 years. I think I know illegal modifications when I see them." "I'm sure you do," Chloe replied diplomatically, "but I'm having trouble identifying the specific components you're citing as violations. The exhaust gas recirculation system appears to be completely stock, and the diesel particulate filter shows no signs of tampering." Carlos Mendoza had been listening to this exchange with growing hope, recognizing that someone with technical knowledge was finally examining his truck with objective rather than accusatory intent. "Miss, I've never modified anything on this engine," he said earnestly. "Everything's exactly the way it came from the factory." Cooper found himself paying closer attention to the dynamics of the situation, noting the contrast between Chloe's systematic technical analysis and Walsh's increasingly defensive responses to legitimate questions. His military experience had taught him to recognize when someone was operating outside normal procedures, and Walsh's behavior was triggering warning signals. "Inspector Walsh," Cooper said carefully, "would you mind walking me through your specific findings? I need to understand the nature of the violations for my incident report." Walsh's hesitation was more pronounced this time, suggesting he was unprepared to provide detailed technical explanations for his allegations. "The modifications are complex," he said evasively. "This isn't something that can be explained to someone without specialized training in emissions regulations." Chloe's engineering education had included extensive coursework in environmental systems, and she recognized that Walsh's reluctance to provide specific details was highly unusual. For someone conducting a legitimate inspection, professional inspectors typically welcomed opportunities to explain their findings to interested observers. "Actually," Chloe said respectfully, "I've studied emissions control systems as part of my engineering coursework at Prairie View. I'd be very interested in understanding what you've discovered, both for educational purposes and because I've worked on similar diesel engines without encountering these particular modifications." The challenge in her words was politely delivered but unmistakably present, and Walsh's response revealed the depth of his discomfort with technical scrutiny. Instead of explaining his findings, he began asserting his authority more aggressively. "This inspection is a matter of state regulatory enforcement," Walsh declared with forced authority. "I don't need to justify my conclusions to unauthorized civilians, regardless of their claimed educational background." Cooper's suspicions crystallized into certainty as he recognized the behavior patterns of someone operating outside legitimate authority. Walsh's refusal to explain his technical findings, combined with his unusual urgency to impound the truck, suggested motivations that had little to do with environmental compliance. "Inspector Walsh," Cooper said with the firm tone he'd learned to use when establishing control over unclear situations, "I'm going to need you to provide detailed documentation of the specific violations you've identified. Standard procedure requires written descriptions of all technical findings." Walsh's face went pale as he realized that his informal approach to the inspection wasn't going to satisfy law enforcement scrutiny. "The documentation will be prepared according to standard protocols," he said weakly. Chloe had been conducting her own systematic examination of the engine compartment while the authority questions were being resolved, and her findings were completely inconsistent with Walsh's allegations. Every emissions control component was not only present and unmodified, but appeared to be functioning properly despite the truck's current power problems. "Mr. Mendoza," Chloe said, turning to address the worried driver directly, "when did you first notice the power loss problems?" 2 days ago, Carlos replied. "Engine started running rough during my run from Denver, and yesterday it got worse. This morning it finally quit completely just before I reached the way station." Chloe nodded, her technical instincts suggesting a pattern that had nothing to do with emissions violations and everything to do with routine mechanical failure. "Did you notice any changes in exhaust smoke color or engine noise patterns?" "White smoke when it first started acting up," Carlos confirmed, "and the engine was making a ticking sound it hadn't made before." The symptoms Carlos described pointed toward a completely different diagnosis than emissions tampering, and Chloe found herself developing a theory that would explain both the mechanical failure and the suspicious nature of Walsh's inspection. If someone had been deliberately sabotaging trucks to create opportunities for fraudulent violations, the pattern would be detectable through systematic analysis. "Inspector Walsh," Cooper said with growing authority, "I'm going to need you to step away from the vehicle while we verify your inspection procedures. There are some questions about this situation that require clarification." Walsh's compliance was reluctant but complete, suggesting he understood that his questionable methods had been exposed. As he moved away from the truck, Chloe began the kind of systematic diagnostic examination that had made her reputation among local truckers. What she discovered in the engine compartment would not only clear Carlos Mendoza of fraudulent charges, but expose a pattern of corruption that reached much deeper into the state inspection system than anyone had imagined. The real investigation was just beginning. Chloe Wilson's systematic examination of Carlos Mendoza's engine revealed something far more disturbing than routine mechanical failure. Hidden beneath the air intake manifold, where only someone with intimate knowledge of diesel engine architecture would think to look, she discovered a small electronic device that had no legitimate purpose in a commercial truck's emission system. The device was sophisticated enough to avoid detection during cursory inspections, but primitive enough to suggest amateur installation by someone with basic electrical knowledge rather than professional engineering expertise. More troubling still, the component appeared designed to create exactly the kind of intermittent power problems that Carlos had been experiencing. "Trooper Cooper," Chloe called out, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who understood. "They'd uncovered evidence of criminal activity. I think you need to see this." Nathan Cooper approached the engine compartment with the heightened awareness that came from years of investigating situations where initial appearances masked deeper problems. What Chloe showed him was a clear case of deliberate sabotage, designed to create the appearance of emissions violations while causing actual mechanical failures. "That's not factory equipment," Cooper observed, studying the unauthorized device with professional attention to detail. "Do you have any idea what it's supposed to do?" Chloe examined the component more closely, her engineering training allowing her to analyze its probable function based on its electrical connections and placement within the engine system. "It appears to be designed to interfere with the turbocharger's boost control system," she explained. "The irregular power losses Mr. Mendoza experienced would be consistent with intermittent turbocharger malfunction." Carlos Mendoza stared at the device with a mixture of amazement and growing anger as he understood the implications of what had been done to his truck. "Someone put that thing in my engine? But when? And why?" Cooper was already developing theories about the why aspect of the sabotage, particularly given Inspector Walsh's suspicious behavior and unusual urgency to impound the truck. The combination of planted evidence and fraudulent inspection procedures suggested a coordinated effort to create violations where none existed. "Mr. Mendoza, when was the last time your truck was serviced?" Cooper asked, beginning the systematic questioning that would help establish when and where the sabotage had occurred. "3 weeks ago at Morrison's Truck Plaza in North Platte," Carlos replied. "Just routine maintenance, oil change, filter replacement, basic safety inspection. Everything was running fine until 2 days ago." Chloe continued her examination of the sabotage device, noting details that would be important for understanding how the scheme operated. The component was connected to the truck's electrical system through factory wiring harnesses, suggesting that whoever installed it possessed detailed knowledge of commercial vehicle electronics. "This kind of installation requires specialized knowledge," she observed to Cooper. "Someone would need access to technical manuals and probably professional-grade diagnostic equipment to integrate this device so seamlessly into the truck's systems." Inspector Walsh had been standing at the periphery of the investigation, his earlier aggressive demeanor replaced by obvious nervousness as the evidence of sabotage emerged. Cooper noticed his discomfort and began to suspect that Walsh's involvement went beyond simple bureaucratic overzealousness. "Inspector Walsh," Cooper said with the formal tone he used when conducting official investigations, "I'm going to need you to document your inspection findings in detail. This situation appears to involve criminal tampering with commercial vehicle safety equipment. Walsh's response was evasive and technically inadequate, confirming Cooper's growing suspicions about his competence and motivations. The inspection procedures are confidential, Walsh claimed unconvincingly. I can't discuss specific methodologies with unauthorized personnel. Chloe looked up from her examination of the sabotage device with an expression that mixed professional curiosity with moral outrage. Trooper Cooper, I think we need to consider the possibility that this isn't an isolated incident. If someone's systematically sabotaging trucks to create false violations, there could be other drivers facing similar problems. The implications of Chloe's observation hit Cooper like a revelation. A coordinated scheme to plant evidence and conduct. Fraudulent inspections would explain several unusual cases he'd encountered over the past few months. Trucks cited for violations that seemed inconsistent with their maintenance records. Drivers facing financial ruin over technical violations. They insisted they hadn't committed. How many similar cases have you handled recently? Cooper asked Walsh directly, his question carrying the weight of official investigation rather than casual inquiry. Walsh's inability to provide coherent answers to basic questions about his inspection activities confirmed that something was seriously wrong with the entire situation. His claims about detecting emissions violations were becoming increasingly implausible as Chloe's technical analysis revealed the actual nature of the mechanical problems. Dr. Rebecca Grant arrived unexpectedly, having heard about the situation. Through the informal network that connected Prairie View Community College to local business and law enforcement activities. Her presence added academic authority to Chloe's technical findings and provided additional credibility for what was becoming a serious criminal investigation. I came as soon as I heard about the inspection irregularities, Dr. Grant explained to Cooper. Chloe's analysis of diesel emission systems has been exemplary in my coursework, and if she's identified sabotage, her conclusions deserve serious consideration. The combination of Dr. Grant's academic credentials and Chloe's demonstrated technical competence created a formidable challenge to Walsh's increasingly untenable claims about emissions violations. His attempts to maintain official authority were crumbling under systematic scrutiny from people who actually understood the technical systems he claimed to be inspecting. Chief Dispatcher Alan Richards arrived in his company truck, having grown concerned about the extended delay in resolving what should have been a routine inspection. His 25 years in the trucking industry had given him extensive experience with legitimate regulatory procedures, and Walsh's approach to the inspection struck him as highly unusual. I've seen hundreds of emissions inspections over the years, Alan told Cooper, and I've never encountered an inspector who refused to explain specific technical findings. Something about this whole situation doesn't add up. Chloe had been photographing the sabotage device and documenting its installation details, creating evidence that would be crucial for any subsequent investigation. Her systematic approach to evidence collection reflected training that went beyond her formal engineering education, suggesting influence from her Aunt Diana's military background. The device has a serial number, Chloe reported to Cooper, and the installation shows specific tool marks that might be traceable to whoever did the work. If this is part of a larger scheme, there should be a paper trail. Cooper began to envision the scope of investigation that would be required to expose what appeared to be systematic corruption involving fraudulent inspections and deliberate sabotage. The case had grown from a simple roadside assistance call into something that would require coordination between state law enforcement, regulatory agencies, and possibly federal authorities. Inspector Walsh, Cooper said with the authoritative tone that indicated he was taking formal control of the situation. "I'm going to need you to provide complete documentation of all inspections you've conducted over the past 6 months. This investigation now involves potential criminal violations of federal transportation safety regulations." Walsh's composure finally collapsed completely as he realized the magnitude of the legal jeopardy he faced. His earlier claims about detecting emissions violations were exposed as fraudulent, and his connection to the sabotage scheme was becoming increasingly obvious through his inability to provide legitimate explanations for his actions. Carlos Mendoza watched this development with growing relief and anger, understanding that he'd been the victim of a deliberate scheme rather than legitimate regulatory enforcement. "How many other drivers have been put through this?" he asked, voicing the question that was on everyone's mind. Chloe's examination of the sabotage device had revealed details that suggested it was part of a manufactured product rather than a custom-built component. The implications were troubling. If someone was mass-producing devices designed to create false emissions violations, the scope of the fraud could be enormous. "Trooper Cooper," Chloe said, her voice carrying the gravity of someone who understood they were dealing with more than isolated criminal activity, "I think we need to test other trucks that have been cited for emissions violations. If this device is being used systematically, we should be able to find similar evidence in other cases." The suggestion was sound from both investigative and technical perspectives, but it also represented a massive undertaking that would require coordination between multiple agencies and careful analysis of inspection records across the entire region. Cooper realized he was looking at what could become one of the most significant transportation fraud cases in Nebraska history. As the afternoon progressed and more evidence of systematic sabotage emerged, Cooper found himself grateful for Chloe Wilson's technical expertise and moral courage. Her willingness to challenge fraudulent authority and her ability to provide credible technical analysis had exposed corruption that might otherwise have continued unchecked. The military dog tags around Chloe's neck caught the late afternoon sunlight as she continued documenting evidence, and Cooper was reminded again of Diana Foster's legacy of service and integrity. Diana had died protecting her fellow soldiers from hidden threats, and now her niece was carrying forward that same commitment to protecting innocent people from a different kind of hidden danger. Sheriff Joseph Parker arrived as the investigation was expanding beyond Cooper's individual authority, bringing additional law enforcement resources and the administrative support necessary for what was becoming a complex, multi-jurisdictional case. His presence signaled that the situation had escalated to the level of serious criminal investigation. "Nathan, what exactly are we dealing with here?" Sheriff Parker asked, surveying the scene with the practiced eye of someone who had seen most. Variations of criminal activity over 30 years in law enforcement. Cooper's briefing outlined the scope of fraud they'd uncovered, from deliberate sabotage to fraudulent inspections, to what appeared to be systematic targeting of independent truckers who lacked resources to challenge official authority. The scheme was sophisticated enough to have operated for months without detection, suggesting professional organization and insider knowledge of regulatory procedures. "This is going to require federal involvement," Sheriff Parker observed after hearing the details. "Interstate transportation fraud falls under federal jurisdiction, and if this scheme crosses state lines, we'll need FBI coordination." Chloe listened to these discussions with growing understanding of how her technical discovery had revealed criminal activity that threatened the entire trucking industry. Her Aunt Diana's military training had emphasized how small, tactical observations could reveal larger strategic threats, and the same principle applied to civilian criminal investigation. As evening approached and the immediate crisis was resolved, Cooper realized that Chloe Wilson had once again demonstrated the kind of integrity and competence that honored Diana Foster's memory while serving the broader community. Her technical skills had prevented an innocent man from facing fraudulent charges, but more importantly, her courage in challenging corrupt authority had exposed systematic fraud that threatened countless other truckers. The investigation that began with a simple mechanical breakdown would ultimately expose a network of corruption that reached much deeper into state regulatory agencies than anyone had imagined. But the foundation for that larger success had been laid by a 19-year-old engineering student who understood that technical knowledge carried moral obligations to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The FBI field office in Omaha resembled nothing so much as a high-tech fortress, its sterile corridors and security checkpoints a stark contrast to the grease-stained world of truck stops and diesel engines where Chloe Wilson felt most comfortable. 2 weeks after exposing the sabotage device in Carlos Mendoza's truck, she found herself at the center of a federal investigation that had grown to encompass multiple states and dozens of fraudulent inspection cases. Special Agent Sarah Martinez had been assigned to lead the investigation into what the Bureau was calling Operation Clean Diesel, a systematic fraud scheme that had been operating across the Midwest for at least 18 months. Agent Martinez was a 20-year veteran of financial crimes investigation, but the technical complexity of diesel engine sabotage represented new territory that required expertise she didn't possess. "Miss Wilson," Agent Martinez said as Chloe entered the conference room where the task force had assembled, "thank you for agreeing to serve as our technical consultant on this case. Your analysis of the sabotage devices has been crucial for understanding how this scheme operates." Chloe took her seat at the polished conference table, feeling somewhat out of place among the federal agents, state investigators, and regulatory officials who had gathered to coordinate the expanding investigation. The military dog tags around her neck felt heavier than usual, reminding her of her Aunt Diana's commitment to protecting others from hidden threats. Nathan Cooper was present as the investigating officer who had first recognized the criminal. Nature of Inspector Walsh's activities. His military experience had proven valuable for understanding the organizational structure of what appeared to be a sophisticated fraud network, and his partnership with Chloe had become central to unraveling the technical aspects of the scheme. "What we've discovered so far," Agent Martinez began, activating a wall-mounted display that showed a map of the Midwest dotted with red markers, "is a coordinated effort to target independent truckers through a combination of mechanical sabotage and fraudulent regulatory enforcement. Each red marker represents a confirmed case where sabotage devices were planted and followed by suspicious inspection activities. The scope of the fraud was staggering. Over 60 trucks had been targeted across Nebraska, Iowa, Kansas, and Colorado, with damages to individual drivers ranging from thousands of dollars in repair costs to complete financial ruin for those who couldn't afford to fight fraudulent charges. The pattern suggested careful selection of victims who lacked resources to challenge official authority. Dr. Rebecca Grant had been invited to participate as an academic expert on emissions control systems, providing additional credibility to Chloe's technical analyses. Her presence also helped ensure that the educational aspects of the case would be preserved for future reference, creating a record that could help prevent similar schemes. The sophistication of the sabotage devices indicates professional engineering knowledge, Dr. Grant explained to the assembled investigators. These aren't crude attempts at mechanical interference. They're precisely designed to create specific failure patterns that would be interpreted as emissions violations by someone conducting a superficial inspection. Prosecutor Robert Mitchell had joined the task force to coordinate federal charges against the individuals involved in the fraud scheme. His political ambitions had initially made him skeptical of cases that involved challenging state regulatory authority, but the mounting evidence of systematic corruption had convinced him that aggressive prosecution was necessary. "Inspector Walsh has agreed to cooperate with our investigation," Mitchell announced, in exchange for reduced charges and protection from potential retaliation. His testimony has revealed the organizational structure behind the fraud scheme, including the involvement of several repair facilities and regulatory officials. Chloe listened to these developments with mixed emotions. While she was gratified that the investigation was exposing systematic corruption, she also understood that the criminal activity had destroyed lives and livelihoods that couldn't be restored simply through successful prosecution. Carlos Mendoza had been fortunate. Many other drivers hadn't been so lucky. Sheriff Joseph Parker provided an update on the state-level aspects of the investigation, which had revealed corruption within Nebraska's Department of Environmental Quality that extended beyond individual inspectors to include supervisory personnel who had been aware of the fraudulent activities. "We've identified at least 12 state employees who were either directly involved in the scheme or who failed to report obvious irregularities in inspection procedures," Sheriff Parker reported. "The administrative cleanup is going to take months, and we'll need to review every inspection conducted by compromised personnel over the past 2 years." Agent Martinez turned to Chloe for the technical briefing that had become central to understanding how the fraud operated. "Miss Wilson, could you walk us through your analysis of the sabotage devices? We need to understand both how they work and how we can detect them in vehicles that may still be affected." Chloe stood and moved to the display screen, where detailed photographs of the devices showed their construction and installation methods. Her presentation combined the technical precision of her engineering education with the clear communication skills she'd developed through teaching mechanical procedures to truckers who needed practical rather than theoretical knowledge. "The devices are designed to interfere with turbocharger boost control systems," Chloe explained, using a laser pointer to highlight key components. "They create intermittent power losses that mimic the symptoms of emissions control system failures, but they're installed in locations where they won't be detected during routine maintenance." The technical sophistication of the scheme impressed even experienced federal investigators. The devices were manufactured to precise specifications, suggesting access to professional engineering resources and specialized production facilities. More troubling still, their design indicated intimate knowledge of federal emissions regulations and inspection procedures. "What's particularly insidious about this approach," Chloe continued, "is that the devices create real mechanical problems that support the false emissions violation claims. A driver experiencing intermittent power loss would naturally seek repairs, and an unscrupulous inspector could use those symptoms to justify impoundment and further investigation." Nathan Cooper provided additional context about how the fraud scheme targeted vulnerable victims. "The pattern shows deliberate selection of independent truckers who were operating on thin profit margins," he explained. "These drivers couldn't afford extended legal battles or expensive technical consultations to challenge inspection findings." Agent Martinez studied the financial records that had been seized from various participants in the scheme, revealing the economic scale of the fraud operation. Conservative estimates suggest this network generated over $2 million in fraudulent fines and repair charges, she reported. "The actual figure could be significantly higher when we account for secondary losses like lost income and business closures." Chloe felt a surge of anger as she considered the human cost of the scheme. Each fraudulent violation represented a family-facing financial crisis, a small business owner watching their livelihood disappear, an honest trucker being labeled as a criminal for violations they didn't commit. The corruption attacked the very foundation of trust that made commerce possible. The most disturbing aspect of this case, Dr. Grant observed, is how it exploited public trust in regulatory authority. Environmental protection is crucial for public health, but using those legitimate concerns as cover for criminal fraud undermines confidence in the entire regulatory system. Defense attorney Amanda Hill had been monitoring the investigation to ensure that the rights of cooperating witnesses were protected and that the prosecution strategy didn't inadvertently harm innocent parties who had been caught up in the scheme. Her public defender background gave her particular sensitivity to cases where official authority had been misused. "We need to be careful about how we handle the drivers who were victimized by this scheme," Hill cautioned. "Many of them are still facing financial hardship from fraudulent charges, and some may be reluctant to come forward because they fear additional regulatory scrutiny." The observation highlighted one of the most troubling aspects of the fraud scheme. Its success had depended partly on victims' fear of challenging official authority. Independent truckers often operated in regulatory gray areas where aggressive enforcement could easily destroy their businesses, making them ideal targets for intimidation-based fraud. Alan Richards joined the meeting to provide perspective from the trucking industry, representing the legitimate business interests that had been harmed by the fraud scheme. His decades of experience in freight logistics gave him insight into how systematic corruption could disrupt transportation networks that the broader economy depended upon. The ripple effects of this fraud extend far beyond the individual drivers who were targeted, Alan explained. When truckers face unexpected financial crises, it affects shipping schedules, supply chains, and ultimately consumer prices. Corruption in regulatory enforcement threatens the entire transportation system. Agent Martinez outlined the next phases of the investigation, which would involve coordinating with federal prosecutors in multiple districts and ensuring that all affected drivers received appropriate compensation for their losses. The complexity of the case required careful coordination to avoid jurisdictional conflicts while ensuring comprehensive prosecution. "Miss Wilson," Agent Martinez said, addressing Chloe directly, "we're going to need your continued technical expertise as this case moves forward. Your ability to explain complex mechanical concepts in accessible terms has been crucial for helping investigators and prosecutors understand how the fraud operated." Chloe nodded her acceptance of the ongoing responsibility, but she also understood that her involvement in the federal investigation would require careful balance with her educational commitments and personal goals. The case had already consumed weeks of her time, and the upcoming trial phases would demand even greater participation. Nathan Cooper recognized the burden that Chloe was accepting and felt a profound respect for her willingness to see the investigation through to completion. Her commitment to protecting other truckers from fraud reflected the same values of service and sacrifice that had defined her Aunt Diana's military career. "There's one more thing we need to discuss," Agent Martinez announced, her tone becoming more serious. "Our investigation has uncovered evidence that this fraud scheme may have been connected to organized crime networks that are involved in broader transportation industry corruption. Miss Wilson, your continued involvement in this case may expose you to potential retaliation." The warning sent a chill through the conference room as participants realized that what had begun as a technical investigation into mechanical sabotage had revealed connections to criminal organizations with the resources and motivation to intimidate witnesses. Chloe's expertise had made her a valuable asset to law enforcement, but it had also made her a potential target. Chloe touched her Aunt Diana's dog tags, drawing strength from the reminder of someone who had faced much greater dangers in service to others. "My aunt always taught me that when you have knowledge that can help people, you use it regardless of personal risk," she said quietly. I'm not going to back down from this investigation because someone wants to intimidate me." Cooper felt a surge of protective concern mixed with admiration for Chloe's courage. Diana Foster had displayed the same unwavering commitment to duty in Afghanistan, even when it meant accepting personal danger to protect others. The family resemblance went far beyond physical appearance to encompass fundamental character traits that defined how they approached moral challenges. As the meeting concluded and the various participants prepared to return to their respective roles in the expanding investigation, Chloe realized that her technical discovery had set in motion events that would ultimately test not just her engineering knowledge, but her personal courage and commitment to justice. The fraud scheme had been exposed, but the most dangerous phase of the investigation was just beginning. The intimidation began subtly, as these things often do, with small incidents that could easily be dismissed as coincidence or accident. Chloe Wilson first noticed the surveillance when she spotted the same grey sedan parked outside her family's home 3 days in a row, its occupant pretending to read a newspaper while keeping watch on their modest 2-story house in Clearwater. Junction's working-class neighborhood, Nathan Cooper had warned her about potential retaliation following her testimony to the federal task force. But the abstract possibility of danger felt very different from the concrete reality of being watched by people who viewed her technical expertise as a threat to their criminal enterprise. The grey sedan disappeared whenever she tried to approach it, confirming that the surveillance was deliberate rather than coincidental. Raymond Wilson noticed the changes in his daughter's behavior before she told him about the surveillance. 25. Years of truck driving had taught him to read road conditions and human behavior with equal skill, and he recognized the signs of someone dealing with pressure that went beyond normal academic or social stress. "Something's bothering you, sweetheart," Raymond said over dinner, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee cup as he studied Chloe's distracted expression. "You've been checking the windows and watching the parking lot at the diner like you're expecting trouble." Chloe hesitated before responding, aware that her parents had already sacrificed enough peace of mind during her involvement in the federal investigation. Patricia Wilson looked up from her meal with the sharp attention of a mother who had learned to detect problems her children might try to hide. "There have been some incidents," Chloe admitted carefully. "Agent Martinez thinks the people involved in the fraud scheme might be trying to discourage my continued cooperation with the investigation." Raymond's expression hardened with the protective anger of a father whose child was being threatened. His military service had been brief, just 4 years as an army mechanic, but long enough to understand how criminal organizations operated and how they dealt with witnesses who threatened their operations. "What kind of incidents?" Patricia asked, her diner waitress experience having exposed her to enough criminal behavior to recognize the warning signs of escalating intimidation. Chloe described the surveillance, the mysterious phone calls with no one on the line, and the more troubling discovery that someone had been tampering with her pickup truck's engine. The sabotage wasn't severe enough to cause immediate danger, but it was sophisticated enough to suggest professional knowledge of automotive systems. "They're sending a message," Raymond observed grimly, "letting you know they can reach you anytime they want, but keeping the pressure subtle enough to avoid triggering a law enforcement response." The analysis was accurate, but cold comfort for a family that had never expected to become targets of criminal retaliation. Chloe's technical expertise had made her valuable to federal investigators, but it had also made her a threat to people who possessed resources and motivation to eliminate threats through intimidation or worse. Nathan Cooper arrived at the Wilson house that evening, having coordinated with federal authorities to provide additional security for key witnesses in the fraud investigation. His concern for Chloe's safety was both professional and personal, rooted in his recognition that Diana, Foster's niece, was displaying the same courage and commitment to justice that had cost Diana her life in Afghanistan. The FBI is taking these threats seriously, Cooper assured the Wilson family as they gathered in their living room. Agent Martinez has authorized protective surveillance and communication monitoring to ensure your safety while the investigation continues. Patricia Wilson studied Cooper's face with the analytical attention of someone who had learned to assess people's sincerity through years of dealing with customers who might or might not pay their bills. What she saw was genuine concern that went beyond professional duty, suggesting personal investment in her daughter's welfare. "How long is this likely to continue?" Patricia asked. "Chloe's got her education to think about, and we can't live under this kind of pressure indefinitely." Cooper's answer was honest, but not particularly reassuring. The investigation is complex, and the trial phase could extend for months. The criminal organization behind this fraud scheme has significant resources, and they're likely to maintain pressure on key witnesses as long as they perceive a threat to their operations. Dr. Rebecca Grant had been monitoring the situation through her academic connections to law enforcement, and she arrived at the Wilson house with a proposal that would address both Chloe's safety concerns and her educational continuity. Her solution was creative, but would require significant changes to Chloe's current academic plans. "I've been in contact with colleagues at the University of Nebraska," Dr. Grant explained, "and they're willing to offer Chloe an accelerated admission to their engineering program with full scholarship support. The campus environment would provide better security than our community college setting, and the advanced coursework would be more appropriate for someone with her exceptional abilities." The offer was generous and would normally represent an incredible opportunity for a student from Chloe's background, but accepting it would mean leaving her family and community during a period when both her testimony and her continued presence were crucial for the ongoing investigation. "I appreciate the offer," Chloe said carefully, "but I don't want to abandon the people who are depending on my technical expertise to expose this fraud scheme. Mr. Mendoza and dozens of other drivers are counting on this investigation to clear their names and recover their losses." Cooper recognized the moral framework that was guiding Chloe's decision, seeing in her response the same commitment to duty that had characterized Diana Foster's approach to military service. Personal safety was secondary to the responsibility she felt toward people who needed her help. Luis Gonzalez had been increasingly concerned about the pressure his girlfriend was facing, and his arrival at the Wilson house that evening reflected his determination to be part of whatever solution they developed. His paramedic training had taught him to recognize signs of stress and trauma, and he could see that the intimidation campaign was taking a psychological toll despite Chloe's outward composure. "Maybe there's a middle ground," Luis suggested. "What if Chloe could complete her testimony and technical analysis remotely? Video conferencing technology should allow her to participate in the investigation without maintaining physical presence in the area." Agent Martinez contacted the Wilson house by secure phone to discuss security options and investigation timeline, providing updates that helped the family understand both the progress being made and the continued risks they faced. Her assessment was sobering, but not hopeless. "We've made significant arrests in the fraud network," Martinez reported, "but the organized crime connections mean that the threat level remains elevated until we can dismantle the entire operation. Miss Wilson's continued cooperation is crucial, but we understand the personal costs involved." Dutch Anderson arrived unexpectedly, having heard about the intimidation through the informal network that connected Clearwater Junction's business community. His presence represented the broader support that Chloe had earned through her service to local truckers, and his proposal offered a practical solution to the security challenges. "What if we created a rotating schedule where Chloe could work from different secure locations?" Dutch suggested. "My shop has good security systems, and there are other facilities in the region where she could continue her technical analysis without maintaining predictable patterns." The suggestion reflected the community solidarity that had emerged around Chloe's investigation, with local business owners and truckers offering resources to protect someone who had risked her safety, to expose corruption that threatened their livelihoods. The support was gratifying, but also highlighted the responsibility she carried. Mrs. Ruth Morgan, the elderly hardware store owner who had become an unofficial community advocate for military families, arrived with a perspective that drew from her decades of experience with families facing difficult choices during times of danger and uncertainty. "Your Aunt Diana faced similar decisions in Afghanistan," Mrs. Morgan told Chloe quietly. "She could have requested transfer to safer assignments, but she chose to stay where she was needed most. The courage to accept risk in service of others is what distinguishes real leadership from mere competence." The comparison to Diana Foster's military service resonated deeply with Chloe, reminding her that the current threats were part of a larger pattern of sacrifice that defined her family's approach to service. Diana had died protecting others from hidden dangers, and now Chloe faced a different but related challenge in exposing corruption that threatened innocent people. Sheriff Joseph Parker arrived with additional security recommendations and an update on state-level coordination with federal authorities. His presence provided official confirmation that law enforcement was taking the threats seriously while working to minimize disruption to the Wilson family's normal life. "We've increased patrol frequency in your neighborhood," Sheriff Parker informed the family, "and we've established communication protocols that will allow rapid response to any suspicious activity. The goal is to maintain your safety without creating a siege mentality." As the evening progressed and various community members and officials discussed security options, Chloe found herself thinking about the larger significance of the choices she faced. The fraud investigation had grown beyond technical analysis to encompass fundamental questions about courage, duty, and the price of standing up to criminal intimidation. Judge Victoria Stone contacted the House by phone to discuss legal protection options and to provide reassurance that the court system was committed to protecting witnesses who had demonstrated the courage to challenge systematic corruption. Her military family background gave her particular appreciation for the sacrifices involved in public service. "Miss Wilson," Judge Stone said during their conversation, "your technical expertise and moral courage have been instrumental in exposing corruption that threatened the integrity of our regulatory system. The court is prepared to provide whatever protection is necessary to ensure that your testimony can be completed safely." The support from official sources was encouraging, but Chloe understood that the ultimate decision about how to proceed rested with her family. The intimidation campaign was designed to make continued cooperation seem too dangerous to justify, and the only effective response was a demonstration that threats would not deter legitimate investigation. "I think," Chloe said finally, addressing the assembled group of family, friends, and officials, "that we need to focus on completing this investigation as quickly and thoroughly as possible. The longer it drags on, the more opportunities these criminals have to intimidate witnesses and interfere with justice." Nathan Cooper felt a surge of admiration for Chloe's decision, recognizing the same principled courage that had characterized Diana Foster's approach to dangerous missions. The choice to accelerate rather than retreat demonstrated leadership qualities that went far beyond technical competence. As the meeting concluded and security arrangements were finalized, Chloe touched her Aunt Diana's dog tags, and felt a connection that transcended individual circumstances. Diana had faced enemy fire to protect her fellow soldiers, and now Chloe was facing criminal intimidation to protect innocent truckers from fraud. The forms of service were different, but the underlying commitment to protecting others remained. Constant across generations, the intimidation campaign had succeeded in raising the stakes of the investigation, but it had also strengthened the resolve of everyone involved in exposing the truth. The criminals behind the fraud scheme had underestimated both the technical competence and moral courage of the people they were trying to silence, and that miscalculation would ultimately contribute to their downfall. The federal courthouse in Omaha buzzed with the controlled tension that marked high-profile criminal trials, its marble corridors echoing with the footsteps of prosecutors, defense attorneys, and federal agents who had spent months preparing for what promised to be one of the most significant transportation fraud cases in Midwest history. Chloe Wilson sat in the witness preparation room, reviewing her technical testimony one final time, while trying to manage the anxiety that came with knowing her words could determine the fate of criminal defendants who had already demonstrated their willingness to intimidate witnesses. Special Agent Sarah Martinez had arrived early to coordinate final security arrangements and to brief Chloe on courtroom procedures that would protect her identity while ensuring her technical testimony reached the jury with maximum impact. The prosecution's case depended heavily on Chloe's ability to explain complex mechanical sabotage in terms that ordinary citizens could understand and find compelling. Remember that the jury needs to see you as both technically competent and completely credible, Agent Martinez advised as they prepared for Chloe's appearance. Defense attorneys will try to undermine your expertise by emphasizing your age and student status, but your actual knowledge and the quality of your analysis will speak for themselves. Nathan Cooper had been granted permission to attend the trial as both the investigating officer and a character witness for Chloe's integrity and competence. His presence provided moral support during what would undoubtedly be a challenging experience, but it also reminded Chloe of the larger significance of her testimony in honoring Diana Foster's legacy of service and sacrifice. The defendants included Inspector Kevin Walsh, whose cooperation with federal investigators had exposed the broader fraud network, but who still faced serious charges for his role in the systematic corruption. His testimony had revealed the participation of organized crime figures who remained at large, adding an element of ongoing danger that kept security concerns at the forefront of everyone's minds. Dr. Rebecca Grant had been called as an expert witness to provide academic context for Chloe's technical findings, ensuring that the jury understood both the sophistication of the sabotage scheme and the exceptional nature of Chloe's diagnostic abilities. Her testimony would help establish the credibility that defense attorneys would inevitably try to attack. Prosecutor Robert Mitchell had prepared meticulously for the technical aspects of the case, working with Chloe to develop visual aids and simplified explanations that would make diesel engine sabotage comprehensible to jurors who might never have looked under the hood of any vehicle, much less a commercial truck. His political ambitions had been put aside in favor of pursuing justice for the dozens of truckers who had been victimized by the fraud scheme. "Miss Wilson," Mitchell said during their final preparation session, "your testimony is the cornerstone of our technical case. The jury needs to understand not just what these devices did, but why their installation required the kind of inside knowledge that proves conspiracy rather than isolated criminal activity." Chloe nodded, understanding that her role extended beyond simple technical explanation to encompass the larger narrative about systematic corruption that had threatened the integrity of commercial transportation regulation. Her engineering knowledge had uncovered the fraud, but her testimony would help ensure that justice was served and similar schemes were deterred. Defense attorney Amanda Hill had found herself in the unusual position of representing several defendants, whose guilt seemed overwhelming, forcing her to focus on mitigating factors and plea negotiations rather than challenging the fundamental evidence that Chloe's analysis had provided. Her respect for Chloe's technical competence had grown throughout the investigation, even as her professional obligations required her to question that competence during cross-examination. "I want you to know," Hill told Chloe privately before the trial began, "that while I'll be challenging your testimony as part of my professional responsibility, I have enormous respect for the courage you've shown in exposing this corruption. Not many people your age would have had the technical knowledge or moral courage to take on a criminal organization." The acknowledgement from defense counsel provided unexpected validation for Chloe's decision to continue her cooperation despite the personal risks involved. Even those whose job required them to challenge her credibility recognized the exceptional nature of her contribution to the investigation. Carlos Mendoza had been called as the primary victim witness, his story providing human context for the technical evidence that Chloe would present. His experience represented dozens of other truckers who had faced similar fraud, and his presence in the courtroom served as a reminder of the real-world consequences of the corruption that the defendants had perpetrated. "Miss Wilson," Carlos said when they met before his testimony, "I can't thank you enough for what you did. Without your technical knowledge and willingness to challenge that inspector, I'd probably be bankrupt and facing criminal charges for violations I never committed." The gratitude was humbling, but also reinforced Chloe's understanding that her technical expertise carried moral obligations to protect people who lacked the knowledge to protect themselves. Diana Foster had died protecting soldiers who couldn't protect themselves, and Chloe was carrying forward that same commitment in a civilian context. Judge Victoria Stone entered the courtroom with the dignified bearing that had characterized her 30 years on the bench, her military family background, providing personal appreciation for the service themes that underlay this particular case. Her management of the trial would need to balance the technical complexity of the evidence with the security concerns that surrounded key witnesses. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Judge Stone began, "you are about to hear testimony regarding a complex criminal conspiracy that involved sophisticated technical knowledge and systematic corruption of regulatory authority. Your task will be to evaluate evidence that ranges from mechanical engineering to organized crime, and to determine whether the prosecution has proven criminal guilt beyond reasonable doubt." The opening statements established the scope of the fraud scheme while preparing the jury for technical testimony that would require careful attention and logical analysis. Prosecutor Mitchell outlined how systematic sabotage had been combined with corrupt inspections to create false violations that generated millions of dollars in fraudulent charges. "The evidence will show," Mitchell told the jury, "that the defendants operated a sophisticated criminal enterprise that combined technical expertise with regulatory corruption to defraud honest truckers of their livelihoods." The scheme was exposed through the exceptional technical analysis of a young engineering student whose courage in challenging corrupt authority prevented countless additional victims. When Chloe finally took the witness stand, she felt the weight of responsibility that came with knowing her testimony could determine whether justice would be served for the truckers who had been victimized by the fraud scheme. Her Aunt Diana's dog tags were hidden beneath her formal blouse, but their presence provided moral support as she faced the most challenging test of her young life. "Miss Wilson," Prosecutor Mitchell began, "please tell the jury about your educational background." and experience with diesel engine systems. Chloe's response was clear and confident, outlining her engineering coursework while emphasizing the practical experience she had gained through her father's trucking career and her aunt's military technical training. Her qualifications were impressive for someone her age, but she was careful not to overstate her expertise or claim knowledge she didn't possess. The technical testimony that followed was both detailed and accessible, with Chloe using visual aids and simplified analogies to explain how the sabotage devices had been designed to create specific failure patterns that would support false emissions violation claims. Her explanations demonstrated both technical competence and genuine understanding of the engineering principles involved. The key insight, Chloe explained to the jury, was recognizing that the devices were too sophisticated for random tampering, but too crude for legitimate modification. They were designed specifically to create problems that would appear to be emissions violations to someone conducting a superficial inspection. Defense cross-examination focused predictably on Chloe's age and student status, but her technical knowledge proved too comprehensive, and her explanations too clear for credibility challenges to gain traction. Each attempt to undermine her expertise only served to highlight the exceptional nature of her analytical abilities. Miss Wilson, Defense Attorney Hill asked during cross-examination, "Isn't it possible that your inexperience led you to misinterpret mechanical problems that might have natural rather than criminal explanations?" Chloe's response demonstrated both technical competence and mature judgment. "That's exactly why I documented everything so carefully and why I insisted on multiple expert confirmations of my findings. The evidence supports criminal sabotage, because no natural failure pattern could create the specific problems these devices were designed to produce." Dr. Grant's expert testimony provided academic validation for Chloe's analysis while placing her achievements in broader context. Her explanation of diesel engine systems and emissions regulations helped the jury understand both the technical sophistication required for the sabotage and the exceptional nature of Chloe's diagnostic abilities. "In my 15 years of teaching engineering," Dr. Grant testified, "I have never encountered a student with Miss Wilson's combination of theoretical knowledge and practical diagnostic skill. Her analysis of these sabotage devices represents graduate-level technical competence applied to a real-world problem of extraordinary complexity." Nathan Cooper's testimony provided law enforcement perspective on the investigation while establishing the credibility and integrity that Chloe had demonstrated throughout the process. His military background gave particular weight to his assessment of her character and commitment to truth. Miss Wilson approached this investigation with the same systematic methodology and moral courage that I've seen in the best military technical personnel, Cooper testified. Her willingness to challenge corrupt authority despite personal risk reflects the highest standards of public service. As the trial progressed through multiple days of technical testimony and expert analysis, the strength of the prosecution's case became increasingly apparent. The evidence of systematic fraud was overwhelming, and Chloe's technical analysis provided the foundation that connected individual criminal acts to the broader conspiracy. Carlos Mendoza's victim testimony brought human dimension to the technical evidence, showing the jury how abstract concepts of fraud translated into destroyed lives and damaged families. His story represented dozens of other truckers who had faced similar victimization, and his presence served as a reminder of why the technical complexities mattered. "They didn't just steal money," Carlos testified, his voice thick with emotion. "They tried to destroy my reputation, my business, everything I'd worked 30 years to build. If Miss Wilson hadn't exposed their scheme, I'd probably be in prison today for violations I never committed." The defense's closing arguments acknowledged the technical evidence while attempting to minimize the culpability of individual defendants who claimed they were following orders or acting under duress. But the systematic nature of the fraud made such explanations implausible, and the jury's verdict reflected their recognition that sophisticated criminal conspiracy required individual choice and moral responsibility. "Guilty on all counts," Judge Stone announced as she read the jury's verdict, her words bringing closure to an investigation that had consumed months of effort and exposed corruption that threatened the integrity of commercial transportation. Regulation. Chloe felt a profound sense of relief and completion as she listened to the guilty verdicts, understanding that her technical expertise and moral courage had contributed to justice for the truckers who had been victimized by the fraud scheme. The trial had tested her knowledge, her integrity, and her commitment to service, and she had proven worthy of the trust that so many people had placed in her abilities. As the court session concluded and participants began dispersing, Nathan Cooper approached Chloe with an expression that mixed professional satisfaction with personal gratitude. "Diana would be proud," he said quietly, his words carrying the weight of 8 years of survivor's guilt that had finally been transformed into recognition that her sacrifice had meaning through the service of others. The trial's conclusion marked not just the end of a criminal investigation, but the beginning of Chloe's understanding that technical expertise carried lifelong obligations to serve others and protect the vulnerable from those who would exploit them. Her Aunt Diana's legacy lived on through her commitment to using knowledge in service of justice, ensuring that the values of military service continued to protect innocent people in civilian life. 6 months after the federal convictions that had dismantled the transportation fraud network, Clearwater Junction celebrated the opening of the Diana Foster Memorial Technical Education Center with a community gathering that brought together truckers, law enforcement officers, federal officials, and local residents who had witnessed an extraordinary young woman's journey from small-town engineering student to nationally recognized expert on transportation security. The Memorial Center occupied a renovated building adjacent to Dutch Anderson's truck stop, its modern classrooms and fully equipped mechanical workshops representing a permanent commitment to the kind of technical education that had enabled Chloe Wilson to expose systematic corruption and protect countless innocent truckers from fraudulent and prosecution. The facility would serve students throughout the region while honoring the memory of a combat engineer whose influence had shaped her niece's approach to service and technical excellence. Chloe stood before the dedication ceremony's podium, wearing her formal University of Nebraska engineering program blazer over a simple white blouse that allowed her Aunt Diana's dog tags to catch the afternoon light streaming through the center's windows. At 20 years old, she had already achieved recognition that most engineers spent decades pursuing, but her remarks focused on community service rather than personal accomplishment. This memorial center represents more than just educational opportunity, Chloe told the assembled crowd, her voice carrying the confidence that came from having faced federal prosecutors, defense attorneys, and criminal conspirators without compromising her integrity or technical standards. It represents the commitment to using knowledge in service of others that my Aunt Diana Foster demonstrated throughout her military career, and that continues to guide technical education in her memory. Nathan Cooper sat in the front row, wearing his dress uniform for the first time since returning from Afghanistan 8 years earlier. The guilt that had haunted him since Diana's death had been transformed through his relationship with Chloe into understanding that survival carried obligations to honor the sacrifice of others through continued service. His promotion to lieutenant reflected both his investigative work on the fraud case and his growing leadership role in transportation security enforcement. Dr. Rebecca Grant had accepted appointment as the Memorial Center's first academic director, bringing her Prairie View Community College engineering program into partnership with the University of Nebraska to create accelerated pathways for technically gifted students from rural communities. Her collaboration with Chloe had demonstrated the potential for combining traditional academic excellence with practical problem-solving skills that served community needs. The Diana Foster Memorial Center will provide opportunities for young people to develop the kind of technical expertise and moral courage that Chloe Wilson demonstrated during the transportation fraud investigation. Dr. Grant explained to reporters who had gathered to cover the dedication ceremony, "Our goal is to ensure that technical knowledge is always paired with ethical responsibility and commitment to protecting others." Special Agent Sarah Martinez had traveled from Omaha to participate in the dedication ceremony, bringing recognition from the Federal Bureau of Investigation for Chloe's exceptional contribution to one of the most successful transportation fraud prosecutions in the agency's history. The criminal network's dismantling had prevented millions of dollars in additional fraud, while restoring confidence in regulatory enforcement throughout the Midwest trucking industry. Miss Wilson's technical analysis and moral courage were instrumental in exposing systematic corruption that threatened the integrity of commercial transportation regulation, Agent Martinez announced during her remarks. Her example demonstrates how individual citizens with specialized knowledge can make crucial contributions to law enforcement and justice when they're willing to accept the risks that come with challenging criminal authority. Dutch Anderson had donated the land for the Memorial Center while committing his truck stop facilities to serve as a permanent training location where students could work on real mechanical problems under professional supervision. His Vietnam veteran background gave him particular appreciation for the connection between Diana Foster's military service and her niece's civilian accomplishments. Diana Foster died protecting her fellow soldiers from hidden dangers, Dutch observed during his dedication remarks. Her niece Chloe carried forward that same commitment by protecting innocent truckers from hidden fraud. The Memorial Center will train future generations to recognize and respond to threats that ordinary people might not understand. Carlos Mendoza had become an unofficial spokesperson for the dozens of truckers who had been victimized by the fraud scheme, his recovery from near bankruptcy serving as evidence that justice could indeed restore what criminal conspiracy had destroyed. His presence at the dedication ceremony represented the community of independent drivers whose livelihoods had been protected through Chloe's technical expertise and moral courage. 6 months ago, I was facing prison for violations I didn't commit, Carlos told the gathering, his voice strong with conviction earned through surviving systematic persecution. Today, I'm back on the road because a young woman had the knowledge to expose fraud and the courage to challenge corrupt authority. The Memorial Center will ensure that other people facing similar problems have access to the technical expertise they need to protect themselves. Judge Victoria Stone had agreed to serve on the Memorial Center's advisory board, bringing judicial perspective to educational programs that would emphasize both technical competence and ethical responsibility. Her military family background provided personal understanding of how service values could be transmitted across generations through education and mentorship. The Diana Foster Memorial Center represents recognition that technical knowledge carries moral obligations, Judge Stone explained during her remarks. Students who develop expertise in complex systems also accept responsibility for using that knowledge to protect people who lack the technical background to protect themselves. Sheriff Joseph Parker announced the establishment of a transportation security task force that would coordinate local, state, and federal efforts to prevent future fraud schemes while providing ongoing protection for witnesses whose courage had exposed criminal corruption. The task force would include technical experts trained at the Memorial Center, ensuring that law enforcement maintained access to specialized knowledge needed for complex investigations. The fraud network we dismantled was sophisticated enough to operate for years without detection, Sheriff Parker acknowledged during his announcement. Preventing similar schemes requires ongoing collaboration between law enforcement and technical experts who understand how complex systems can be manipulated for criminal purposes. Mrs. Ruth Morgan, now 81 but still sharp as the hardware, store inventory she had managed for decades, spoke for the community elders who had watched Chloe's transformation from curious child to nationally recognized expert, with the pride that came from witnessing hometown talent achieve extraordinary accomplishment while maintaining local values. Chloe Wilson could have used her abilities for personal advancement in any number of ways, Mrs. Morgan observed, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had watched several generations grow up in Clearwater Junction. Instead, she chose to follow her aunt's example of using exceptional gifts in service of others. The Memorial Center will teach future students that the greatest achievements come from helping people rather than accumulating personal success. Luis Gonzalez had completed his paramedic training while supporting Chloe through the investigation. In trial, their relationship strengthened by shared commitment to careers focused on helping others during times of crisis. His proposal of marriage had been accepted with the understanding that both their professional obligations would involve serving communities rather than pursuing maximum financial gain. Chloe taught me that having specialized knowledge means accepting responsibility for protecting people who need help, Luis said during his remarks at the dedication ceremony. Our careers will be built around emergency response and technical education because we understand that serving others is more fulfilling than serving ourselves. Raymond Wilson had watched his daughter's journey from proud but worried father to someone who understood that exceptional children faced exceptional responsibilities that parents could support but not fully protect them from experiencing. His own military service had been modest compared to Diana Foster's heroic sacrifice, but he recognized the family values that had shaped both sisters' approach to duty and service. Diana always said that knowledge without service was selfishness, Raymond told the gathering, his voice thick with emotion as he remembered conversations with his sister-in-law about raising children who would use their abilities for others rather than themselves. Chloe learned that lesson so well that she's teaching it to all of us now. Patricia Wilson had returned to work at Mum's Place Diner with new appreciation for the community networks that had supported her family during the investigation's most dangerous phases. Her daughter's achievements reflected not just individual brilliance, but the collective commitment of neighbors, teachers, and friends who had contributed to educational opportunities that rural communities often struggled to provide. We're proud of what Chloe accomplished, Patricia said simply, but we're even more proud of who she became in the process. The Memorial Center will help other families discover what their children can achieve when they have access to quality education and strong community support. As the formal dedication ceremony concluded and participants gathered for the reception that would celebrate both the Memorial Center's opening and Chloe's acceptance to the University of Nebraska's accelerated doctoral program in mechanical engineering, Nathan Cooper found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. 8 years earlier, he had survived an IED ambush in Afghanistan because Diana Foster had recognized hidden danger and sacrificed her life to protect her fellow soldiers. Today, he was witnessing the dedication of an educational facility that would train future generations to recognize and respond to hidden dangers in civilian life, carrying forward Diana's legacy of protective service in ways she never could have imagined. Chloe joined Cooper near the memorial plaque that bore Diana's photograph and service record, both of them understanding that the completion of the fraud investigation had created opportunities for reflection and forward planning that the crisis atmosphere had prevented. The Memorial Center represented permanence in a way that criminal prosecutions and security measures could not, ensuring that Diana's influence would continue shaping technical education for decades to come. She would have loved seeing this, Chloe said quietly, her fingers touching the dog tags that had started Cooper's recognition of the family connection 8 months earlier. Aunt Diana always believed that the best way to honor someone's sacrifice was to create opportunities for others to serve. Cooper nodded, finally able to speak about Diana's death without the overwhelming guilt that had haunted him since Afghanistan. She saved my life so I could be here today, helping dedicate a center that will train people to save others. I understand. Now that survival isn't about individual luck, it's about carrying forward the mission of protecting people who need protection. As the afternoon progressed and the celebration moved from formal ceremony to informal community gathering, Chloe found herself surrounded by the people whose support had made her achievements possible, while looking forward to educational opportunities that would expand her ability to serve an even broader community of people facing technical challenges they couldn't solve alone. The transportation fraud investigation had demonstrated that individual expertise could make crucial differences in protecting community welfare. But the Memorial Center represented institutional commitment to ensuring that such expertise would be available whenever and wherever it was needed. Diana Foster's legacy would live on through generations of students who learned not just technical skills, but the moral obligation to use those skills in service of others. The November wind that had carried the scent of diesel exhaust and approaching winter on the day Chloe first diagnosed Bill Hendrick's turbocharger failure now carried the sounds of celebration and the promise of educational opportunities that would transform rural Nebraska's approach to technical training. The Memorial Center stood as permanent testimony to the principle that knowledge gained strength through service, that individual sacrifice could create lasting institutions, and that the values of military service found their fullest expression in civilian contributions to community welfare. Standing in the Memorial Center's main workshop, surrounded by the tools and equipment that would train future generations of technically competent and morally committed students, Chloe Wilson understood that her journey from small-town curiosity to national recognition had just begun. Diana Foster's dog tags would continue to remind her that expertise carried obligations, that service required courage, and that the greatest achievements came from using exceptional abilities to protect ordinary people from extraordinary dangers they could neither understand nor overcome alone. The dedication ceremony marked not an ending but a beginning, the establishment of permanent educational infrastructure that would ensure Diana Foster's legacy of technical excellence and selfless service would continue protecting innocent people long after everyone present had moved on to other challenges and other opportunities to serve. In honoring one soldier's sacrifice, the community had created lasting opportunities for countless future students to discover their own capacity for service, ensuring that the values worth dying for would continue guiding the living toward lives worth living. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss this. Just click to watch, and don't forget to subscribe. It would mean a lot.